Everything you're reading, everything you're hearing is true. It's next on Locked On Jazz. Pow.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
How are you? I'm David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider. This is Locked On Jazz. It's your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. For those of you who tune in each and every day, thank you for being an everydayer. We are free and available on all podcasting apps, including YouTube. And thank you for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. We'll talk about the next steps for the Jazz evaluation, some NBA notes. We'll lead today with Frank Layden. There's a sadness to the passing of Frank Layden because if there was ever a rule and a societal change and a biological change, that if you lived a good enough first 90 years, you automatically got healthy and got another 90. This would be the guy. Life is everyone has passed. And so this is about as full of life as you get. So the sadness is that we somehow couldn't find some new rule in life that allowed Frank to go forever, because he just made everyone's life better every day. And that would be the justified right thing to reward him for what he did for everyone else that he was ever around and ever lived with, and ever got to cross his path. There's a tendency around death to highlight a few good things about someone, make them big, and honor their life. And obviously, at times, ignore the others. That is not what's happening right now. This is truly who Frank Layden was. This is the stories you're hearing about school projects and him having people come over to the house and just being open to everyone are 100% true. The humor stories will take the headline because those are the Morgana falling and all the others. But that can short shift one of the most remarkable people in regards to how he treated everyone that I've been around. So the first, I don't want to overplay this. There are a million people that are much closer to Frank than I am, but I was fortunate enough, just so you have it in context, that he took over for Debbie Thomas. No, it wasn't. What was her name? Denise Taylor. Debbie Thomas, the Olympian. Denise Taylor is as the Stars head coach when I was doing the WNBA play-by-play. So we traveled a little bit then. Got to know each other then. And then when I came back to Utah, he was still around, though not as much with the Jazz. And then we did for a while a first Tuesday of every month, we did a luncheon that was Ron McBride, Frank Layden, it was after Lavelle passed, Jerry Sloan, Mark McCowan, former Jazz strength and conditioning, Gary Briggs, former trainer, Dave Fredman, who came with Frank to New Orleans, Phil Johnson. So that whole crew, the old crew. And I organized it a little bit as a payback to them. Barbara and the women would have a lunch at the Grand America across the street, and then we would have lunch at Little America, and it was wonderful. And that's probably when I spend the most time with Frank, or around that. The person, and I would call and check in periodically, not a huge amount, but occasionally. I would share with you that my biggest thing is you would call Frank or see Frank, and you would feel better every single time you ever interacted with him. Every single time. It's incredible. So, think about if you could do that. I mean, it'd be amazing. I don't know. If you're just thinking about death often makes, I think, people think about how they should live their own lives. I don't know how you do it, but he did it. He did it in a manner that every time I saw him, he would tell me how great work I'm doing, how proud I should be, and this and that, and you'd believe it every time. There was a magic about he and Barbara. When they were together, there was an authenticity, that's the word you're going to keep hearing me say, to their love and their enjoyment of each other and who they were and what they were doing with their lives, and that you just exuded from them to you. Pretty awesome. Barbara's amazing. One of the things that I think of when I think of Frank and Barbara is their love of the arts. And that I think sports was an art for them, the way that you love the arts. And I think if we track, I'm going to guess, their philanthropy, I think they were incredibly important in what they did to the arts. These were New Yorkers who came to Utah and I think understood the value of having culture and tried to, I don't want to put words in their mouth, and tried to bring some culture to Utah that we didn't have due to our lack of history. It's pretty great. They embraced Utah in a way to improve it every day. Larry H. Miller had a great line, do good until all the good's done. It was clear the Laydens were hoping to try to help Utah. Ryan Smith's now doing this grandiose manner. They were trying to do it in subtle manners. Bringing the arts, supporting things that maybe hadn't been a part of our culture, the theater and things of that nature, to improve the experience of the people who lived here and add some depth to the experience. Really just that, like, amazing. The humor, definitely good mood there. You spent time with him and you got the joke or two every time. Like there was the moment he did something that made you laugh. We also would leave the Little America Cafe and he would take pictures with 12 people. It wasn't the picture. It wasn't like he was taking a picture and moving on. He was shaking your hand. He was looking in your eye. He was talking to you, and he treated literally everybody the exact same. Every single person he interacted with, he treated the exact same. It was pretty awesome. So the person is the one that, like, I think is being honored appropriately. And if you hear Thurl Bailey talk about the love, like, it's really awesome. What he did from a Utah Jazz standpoint it's mind-boggling if you think about it. The Jazz came to Utah. We'd had the Stars. We had the University of Utah. We didn't know the NBA. We didn't have a history to it. We kind of had to learn it. We were this expansion city. We hadn't had a major sport before. We weren't a particularly advanced city, to be perfectly honest with you. Western Airlines hadn't really started flying in here a lot. We were pretty behind a little bit. We were in our own little bubble. And here this guy comes as this wild salesman with all this humor and all this everything. And Tom Nasalke's the head coach. And they find a way to make it work here. Dave Fredman, Frank Layden came from New Orleans. And it's crazy that they made it work. Crazy. And then not only did they make it work, but it's like you go back and look at the build, and the build's pretty incredible. We're going to talk about, the Jazz next steps here coming up. But when you look at what Frank did to build the franchise and actually go back through it as a learning lesson, as a general manager, it's pretty incredible. I mean, they're 24-58 their first year. They're 28-54 their next year. They're 8-12 halfway through that year, and Frank replaces Tom Nasalke. And that's not a particularly good team. That's Adrian Dantley's doing some stuff for them at this point. He's scoring 30 points a game. Ricky Green, they've just drafted Darryl Griffith. It's Jeff Wilkins and James Hardy and Ben Poquette. And I think Bill Robenzine's probably on that team. And I'm probably going to run out of names at that point. But a little bit of Frank Layden's mastery is that he goes and finds Ricky Green, knows to draft Darryl Griffith, goes and finds Ricky Green off the scrap heap, turns him into an all-star. They draft Danny Shays. They still kind of have the same group, and they go pick up some various pieces. And by 83, 84, he's taken this team in a 3-year span with really similar pieces. He's added Mark Eaton out behind from underneath the mechanic shop, and he's drafted Thurl Bailey, and they make the playoffs. And all of a sudden, Ricky Green is an all-star and a top 20 MVP candidate and a defensive player of the year candidate. And Adrian Dantley's rolling, and 22-year-old Thurl's making plays as a starter then. And, he suddenly develops and he grabs Bobby Hansen off the scrap heap and turns that into something. And they were an incredible playoff team, far beyond what their records were. And they start to build this thing. And then he has two of the greatest draft picks of all time. Two of the greatest draft picks of all time in John Stockton and Karl Malone. And in the midst of all of it, they have the great series with the Lakers and stories and it gives the franchise credibility. And, we often hear that without Larry H. Miller and the investment, when Sam Battistone wanted to leave, the franchise would leave. Without Frank Layden, there's no Larry H. Miller. Without Frank Layden, there's no Larry H. Miller. So it's pretty awesome. And then there's the story, which I'll share with you next, on how he turns this thing over to Jerry Sloan, which is the next Mount Rushmore piece that he allows to have happen in Utah. I'm certain he fits on Mount Rushmore. I also think every other piece on Mount Rushmore in Utah Jazz history is because Frank put it there. That's how important this guy was to us. We'll talk about it as we continue. Thursday edition of Locked On Jazz is brought to you by Monarch Money. Sometimes you think about monitoring your money as a bad thing. Let's talk about it as a good thing. What do you mean? Well, if you actually monitor it, do it well, it allows you to have more trips, more purchases, more events, put you in a position to make bigger purchases down the road if you find a way to see what you're doing and you do it well and you show a little discipline. And that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's like having your own personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Give yourself a little pat on the back for doing it well and reward yourself. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. So managing, it can be, we bypassed this, which allowed us to save this, which allows us to get this, however you do it. So, there's the old takeout subscription things you just try to monitor. But there also can be like, oh, we're running a surplus of X amount of dollars every month, and this allows me to do this. It's great. So set a financial goal, be serious about it, and let Monarch Money help you get there. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com. That's 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year with Monarch Money. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcasting apps. Remembering the great Frank Layden. Should be doing it with a smile on their face. So the story on Frank with Jerry Sloan is that Frank, you never know on these stories. But Frank, they finished the Western Conference semifinals in 87-88. That's when they lose to the Lakers, that great series. They lose it in 7 games. Stockton and Malone are kind of hitting their own. Thurl's really moved into his role. Mark Eaton's your center. Bobby Hansen's developed. Daryl Griffith, Kelly Tripucka, Mark Averoni, an aging Ricky Green at that point, I think in his 30s, which was for a guard at that point was old. And Frank moves into the next season in 88-89. And the Jazz are having a fine year. If I remember correctly, they're kind of doing their thing. They opened the year that year, and they opened the year 8-2. They win 6 or 7 in a row right out of the chute. I remember talking to Frank about this. And they get to about 11-6. And they're 17 games into the season. They're playing just fine. And Frank resigns. Like, what? Like, they had won their last game against the Washington Wizards. They'd lost the night before against the Warriors. They beat the Kings the night before that, lost to the Lakers, beat the Bulls, lost to the Sonics. They lost some road games. Jazz were never a very good road team for years. They had the great home court advantage. And so 17 games into a season coming off a good year, it's an illogical time for a head coach to step down. And the story, as Frank tells it, was that he wanted to make sure Jerry Sloan got the job. And the only way he could make sure that Jerry Sloan, who he thought was the right guy to get the job, got the job was to just resign 17 games into a season at 11-6 in the record. It's a pretty good vision. Think about this from a pure basketball standpoint. The guy comes to a virgin market, teaches at the NBA, builds up a fandom, builds a winner, gives the city credibility, has maybe the greatest 2-draft sequence in the history of the NBA. I mean, I'm not sure anyone has ever had a better back-to-back drafts than the Jazz had in Karl Malone and John Stockton, considering draft position. I'm pretty certain. And then hands the reins of the job over to one of the longest tenured great coaches of the NBA. What a run. I mean, talk about a Midas touch. Pretty incredible. And Scott Layden, his son, does remarkable things as well. And that, with all that, I would tell you we should talk about the person today. And tomorrow, and the next day, and just forever. This guy. This guy. Right here. Every day. Because it make us a little better. All right. Let's change topics. Awkwardly. What's next for the Jazz? And the answer to me is evaluation. This gets a little bit into yesterday's conversation for I don't know on some of these guys. If you look at Oklahoma City, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is the key to everything, certainly. And then they just hit on Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren. And they hit on Lou Dort. What they really did was made fabulous evaluation decisions. And they didn't marry themselves to players. And they didn't marry themselves to draft picks. So if you look back at Oklahoma City, if you recall, they really tanked for 2 years. And then they move out of it pretty quickly because of Shai. And if you go to those 2 years and you look at some of the guys they had, and Oklahoma City is, now the model, but we can look at other teams. And I think Houston might have just done this with Jalen Green, to their credit. But Oklahoma City goes 22-50, then they go 24-58, and then they go 40-42, and then they move. So 5 years, they really quite the run. But the first year, if you look at the 22-50 team, which was pretty poor, 22-50 will be poor, certainly. And Shai plays only 35 games, and they realize what they have. He averages 24 points. They then are playing a bunch of other guys. One of them is Darius Bazley. He scores 14 points, has 7 rebounds, 2 assists. He seems to be an interesting player. Another was Lou Dort. Another was Theo Maledon. And another was Alexei Pokusevski. Those 4 guys got a tremendous amount of time on that roster. And they were, somewhat committed. They had drafted Bazley with the 23rd pick of the draft. They had drafted Theo Maledon with the 34th pick of an NBA draft. They had drafted Pokusevski with the 17th pick of an NBA draft. So they had, these were their guys. These were their picks that they had at that point. They also had a 45th pick that they drafted, Hamidou Diallo, who, you hear very little of. So those were 4 of their guys. The next year, they have Bazley. Shai, again, plays just 56 games. And then Bazley plays 69. He's 21 years old. He's long. They have Pokusevski. Well, now they have Trey Mann, who was their 18th pick of the draft. They've added Josh Giddey, Lou Dort, still there, Theo Maledon, Aaron Wiggins, and they've added the 32nd pick of the draft in Jeremiah Robinson Earl. So they have all of these draft picks they've added. Bazley, Pokusevski, Mann, Giddey, Dort, Maledon, Wiggins, Jeremiah Robinson Earl. They add Kendrick Williams to roster. Ty Jerome's floating around. They don't get married to them. In the third year, when they start to get good, Shea now plays 68 games. Giddey's playing 76. They've now Lou Dort, who was undrafted. The other guys were Baisley was drafted. Mann was drafted. Pokusevski was drafted. Robinson Earl was drafted. Malone was drafted. Dort rises up. Kendrick Williams, who they picked up off the scrap heap, having played at New Orleans, and they acquire undrafted, rises up. And they basically punt on Darius Baisley after 2 years. And they say, all right, we saw it for 2 years. You're 6'8", 208. You got all these skills, but we're going to move on. He actually had him for 3 years because there was one prior, and they move on from him, and they cut the tie. And they look at Theo Maledon, who's an early draft pick of theirs. And they, after 2 years, move on. And they take Aaron Wiggins, and suddenly he plays who was the 55th pick of a draft, and they move him to the sixth most amount of minutes on the roster. And they take Isaiah Joe, who they picked off the scrap heap from Philadelphia, who after 2 years in Philadelphia, and they move him in the fifth most minutes on the roster. While Pokusevski, who was an early draft pick, a 17th pick of an NBA draft, and they decide that's enough. This is where they were really special, is they didn't get married to their guys. I'll continue on this one, plus news notes, plus our group thing is done and how the NBA needs to change the NBA Cup as we continue here on Locked on Jazz. So staying with the Thunder for a second. And by the time they're really good in the 23-24 season, well, now who's playing for them? But Shea, Chet Holmgren, now Jalen Williams, Lou Dort, Giddey, Cason Wallace, they've drafted, moves his way up. But all of a sudden, Osam Jang, who was another one they drafted as Osam Jang is a 11th pick of an NBA draft. And they don't get married to him. He's still on the roster. He's just not relevant. He's a cost control player. But Trey Mann, they move on. Their former 18th pick of an NBA draft in the 23-24 season, they trade him to Charlotte. They get off it. And they don't worry necessarily about what they're getting back. And Alexei Pokusevski, who was their 17th pick of a draft in the 23-24 season, they get off of it and send him out. And he's never played again. This is where the Thunder were really special, is they did not get married to their guys. And they opened the door of player development for players that didn't match their spot. So the guys that survived, the guys that are still a part of it, sure, Chet Holmgren, second pick, Jalen Williams, but are Aaron Wiggins, a 55th pick, Isaiah Joe, who they didn't draft, Kendrick Williams, who they didn't draft, are the guys that survived. But Darius Baisley, who they did draft, gone. Theo Maledon, who they did draft, gone. Pokusevski, who they did draft, gone. Jeremiah Robinson Earl, early second-round pick, gone. Osam Jang, still on the roster, but irrelevant. They jettisoned 5 basic first or early second-round picks and said, nope, doesn't have the skills we need. That's the next step for the Utah Jazz, is to nail the evaluation on these guys and move off who doesn't have it fast. That's what OKC did impressively. The group play is set by the NBA, the new NBA Cup, which will be on Amazon Prime with Emmy Award-winning producer-director Travis Henderson. Oklahoma City, Minnesota, Sacramento, Phoenix, and Utah. Obviously, I don't think we're going to win stages, but you never know. Actually makes it kind of fun for us. We go after it. You never know. You catch someone on a good day. You win a game. You do something else. Who knows? This is where I think the NBA's blown it. I can't tell you who our group stage was last year, and I can't tell you who it was the year before. I have a bad memory. I could probably figure it out. But I think this is where divisions matter. The NBA should hold to their divisions. I've always thought that we should get rid of conferences and increase the interest in divisions. And have the same group stage every year. So ours should be Oklahoma City, Denver, Minnesota, Portland, and Utah. Should be our division, Northwest Division, which is weird because Oklahoma City is not Northwest, but that's a side note. And have rivalry that Oklahoma City's won the Northwest Division Cup 2 years in a row and looking for the third, or the Denver's won it, or the Jazz have upset. Like, that's what we should have. The same groupings every year to create rivalry and create history. If you want another side note on this, I think we should go to one conference with just divisions and move the schedule around more so that Western Conference players play in the East more and Eastern Conference players play in the West more. Travel's not that bad. That's just my thought. A few other notes. Devin Booker's now got a 5-year, $316 million contract. See how this works out. I don't know what you're supposed to do. The Paulo Banchero deal is big too, and I'm not totally full of that. I'm not sure what these teams are supposed to do. I think you're stuck maxing them out. And it's why teams do something crazy like trade Luka, but in trading Paulo would have been crazy, and trading Booker at this point, without their draft picks would have been insane. But I'm not sure I think these deals are good deals. But I don't have another option for you. So I think it's all you can do. It used to be in the NBA that if you had a player going to be a free agent, you kept on them because you knew you could trade that slot. The John Collins, Norman Powell trade's interesting to me because a little bit to me, this is someone saying on the free agent note of things that if I have Norman Powell on my roster, now it might be to have just cleared space for Bradley Beal and that John Collins then makes better roster and they're going to add Beal and they're going to add Paul, and then this is a side. But if I have a free agent who's going to be hunting points and rebounds and assists as he should be because he's a free agent, he's trying to make money, I'm actually going to move him if I'm not going to sign him. If I was John Collins, I would have hunted every point and every rebound you ever could have imagined for the Utah Jazz next year. On a team that wouldn't win, I would just make sure I got points and rebounds so I could make money as a free agent. It's the way the league works. No problem with that. Almost you're forced to do that. So I don't know if I almost feel like teams are moving off of players that are in their final year of a deal more than they used to. Interesting quote from Channing Frye. It was good on these. Saying players fall in love with being famous in LA and out of love with basketball. Could be an argument that instead of wanting these big markets, you should actually want to go to Utah. Just a thought. Might be a better place for everyone. Thoughts to Barbara Layden, Scott Layden, the Layden family, the grandkids, Michael Layden, and everyone in there. And thank you all for sharing Frank with us. It was incredible run. I feel super honored and privileged to have gotten to know him a little bit and to be able to share the stories with you today. Back with you tomorrow with an Ask LOJ edition of Locked on Jazz. Have a great one. Thank you very much. We now send you the first ever 24/7 national NBA channel. If you haven't checked out Locked on NBA with Doug Branson, Matt Moore, and Hayes, it's the best NBA show out there. I love it. I'm not just saying it. I love it. It's amazing. Go check it out.